Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out this morning. I'm talking today about some research that I, representing Sigma Consulting Solutions, David and Oliver conducted last year. And this is very much kind of like a positional paper, just kind of like talking about the research from a kind of like a general perspective. And I represent kind of like the shallowest end of the academic side of this. So nice questions if that's okay. So yeah, firstly to just talk about a little bit about the research. So it was undergone through something called a knowledge transfer partnership, which is a government-funded scheme. They've always previously looked at kind of engineering things, so it's quite unusual to have a research program that looks at knowledge bases. So how to kind of infuse the amazing research that everyone does into HCI and theory generally to the day-to-day industry of like user experience and design and building websites. A couple of lines around like Oliver's research as well, as he specialises in kind of like private mental health care. So there's kind of like a lot of experience kind of to add to the paper from both an academic and an industry perspective. So the focus really was around like an aging population and digital inclusion overall. So we do live in an aging population, that's like not under dispute. But the way in which we approach, I'll broadly use the term over 65s because it's what the government uses, but I understand that that falls into like two categories of kind of like 65 to 80 and later age. But how we design for that group is very different from probably how we design and test for other groups. But it's important and it matters, and I get that's what the paper's really all about, and why it has a great deal of value. And one of the areas that we focused on specifically were neurocognitive disorders such as dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And through that, we looked at the role of personhood, a person's sense of self, of being and identity, and the effect of that in not only using technology, but relational aspects and engaging with other people. And also, to some degree, the awareness and stigma of a disability. I mean, generally, when we talk about older people and computers, there is a bit of a joke along with that, but I think the conditions of dementia somewhat compound that, and generally their representation in technology. So just to talk a little bit more about personhood, where we referenced Kitwood and the idea of kind of like the relevance for a new culture in dementia care. When we talk about somebody kind of like losing it, I guess, and losing their marbles and getting like an idea of themselves, we don't really often think about how that really affects their use of technology, or even what technology can be developed to help them. And one of the things that I did as part of my research is conducted several diary studies, which I'll come into a bit later, but also attended very rural locations supporting people living with dementia. So in the diary studies, we had some in Dorset, quite far away from Salford, but also Tavistock, which is like deep, dark Devon. And these are very interesting communities because I don't think there's something in the water or anything, but there is a natural inclination for people in quite rural communities to have dementia. And that's simply because of the way that migration and populations moved. You move to a rural area and retire. But these are the areas that are most affected by a lack of broadband, a lack of internet, kind of like you get there and you've got no signal for like a good, the entire time you're walking around. So these are the real kind of like vulnerable communities, and speaking to these people and also the carers in that environment and what they're using, because they use technology for their day-to-day lives, they use computers in their jobs. How are they then looking after those family members? How are they then kind of, working with them? And the element that we looked at specifically again was the idea of skeuomorphism. Just to explain, I don't know if anyone remembers when Apple's design had like a yellowing notepad, and you opened up that sort of like a magazine area, and it would just kind of like had that like a shelf-like appearance. It's where a digital interface tries to reflect its real-life counterpart. And this was a massive thing in the early 2000s because it helped onboard people. It kind of gave people an idea of what that was supposed to do. If it behaved like a book, it felt like a book, it must be something that you read and interact with. But it's a very faux pas. Like it's seen as crippling almost the ability for a designer to design. And there's lots of debates nowadays. We talk about skeuomorphism being dead. mainly because if you were to really represent the internet, it would probably look something a bit like this in its real sense. So where's the line in kind of the real world and the offline? And do we even still need it? Talks about like floppy disks now as the save icon. Does it even still have relevance? The real world no longer matches up in the same way as the digital devices. But it's worth remembering, and certainly I remember that this helped me learn. This helped me understand that not only what that interface did, but its position in my life and how I related to that. So we very much looked at the idea of like reassurance in kind of in skeuomorphism. So this particular screen grab here is a usability study that we, Sigma and Sept did with Independent Age. And we were just looking, just a kind of typical website. They committed like some of the things that we often kind of joke about, like hiding navigations behind like the 3-line burger icon and the way in which it structured information on the page. But moreover, and in a much more detailed way, was the idea of, did this information relate to me? Is this something that I can appropriate? When it opened up a PDF, you were no longer on the website, and you were in somewhere completely different, and you wouldn't even think you could scroll. Like real fundamental aspects that will change the way in which people with dementia use technology. But in doing this and this kind of research, we also saw elements of an interface that I innate. Really naturally good. So quite early on in the research, we're watching a 92-year-old lady learn how to use Asda for the first time. And as she passed the cursor over something and it would enlarge and change shape, she knew that was clickable. There are elements of a design that we can learn from and work with without having to teach more. So the role of accessibility is something we talk about a lot, but accessibility tends to be when you're already sat here and somebody's already at the computer and how it's usable. But inclusion and what really the session is about is the whole set of touch points and the whole environment by which people interact with technology. It's not just about what happens when we get to your service, like what led them to it, what will they do afterwards, and thinking about the whole holistic journey. So on this kind of like thought, we were talking about how could people get on board with this? And this was a quote from one of the participants of just the last study, who was beginning to suffer with neurocognitive issues, but was still very kind of like tactful and fluent. And there's quite a few quotes in this, and I won't go into all of them, but this one was particularly poignant. Nobody left to get to call or get in contact with, and that's a user need. That's something that we talk about all the time. We're very happy to do user research, like, oh, we've got budget to do some testing, but we don't speak to these people. We don't speak to over 65s in the same way, and we would have totally missed this. This isn't a thing that we would have thought of onboarding onto the service. And so from this, we kind of like sprung into doing diary studies. And I can talk about this all day, so I'll try and be briefly excited about it. But the interesting thing about them is there was a fantastic book study where people could kind of like draw their favourite books, and the framework was the same. It was just kind of like a colouring, like a sketchbook of these different book colours. But people drew their different covers on and things like that. And each one looks so fantastically different. And I like diary studies because they allow people to convey their experiences in their own language, which is really meaningful. And when, as you know, I would never presume as a researcher that I had that entire frame of reference of someone from an entirely different world almost using technology. So usability studies in their traditional sense of sitting someone down in front of the computer and getting them to think aloud wouldn't capture these things, because you've already displaced a user from their natural comfort zone, how they would actually use that technology. So diary studies serve as a good capture to that. And much like that kind of like book competition study thing, people make them their own. Through the study, there were like little notes and anecdotes and expressions, and people typed up pages, they stuck things in them, they became these very customizable but not digital things. And throughout these diaries, I won't kind of like delve too much into it, but we discovered some fantastic things. And one of the benefits of this was in the diary, this lady kept referring to something called the cod. And I wasn't quite sure what that was. So in the interview, I asked her, and she spoke about having an Xbox 360, which she regularly uses to play Call of Duty with her autistic grandson, who lives a good 100 miles away. So it's just her talking about the experience of buying it, that she'd gone into games, she'd asked for an Xbox 360, and she regularly played it. Towards the end of the study, even just in the 4-week period, her issues were not around using the game. That had become, if you gave her the controller and you're already in the game, she could play it. It was in turning the telly on, finding that fiddly source button, getting to the point that the alien bits that brought you into the game, the actual using of the interface was fine, though she did express fear of, like, I don't know how I'll feel when I eventually lose this, and how having this way of speaking to my grandson taken away from me. Another participant in the diary spoke quite a lot about watching TED Talks on her phone, and was all into that VR. Like, do you mean virtual reality? She's like, oh yes, can't do the Geordie accent, but oh yes. Very, very excited about it, and excited about the future. And she talks about being able to see things for the first time, and being able to interact with a world that she would never have been able to interact with in real life, without having to learn how to do anything, without having to, like, touch or foible around or remember how to boot up a computer. And just for reference, that's the participant. That's Jean on the left-hand side there. Not on the left, Justin, but you'll see him later. But just to get into the concept of that, this is an audience that you would never typically consider, and yet they're valuable. And this is a very long quote, and I won't go too much into it, but I wanted to talk about the praises of getting people to speak about their experience using devices in their own words, and the way it fits into their experience. So this is kind of like a general entry, 4 days worth of things, and she just talks about getting up at 5:30, checking her banking, and for some of the diaries, I did my utmost to actually get to their houses for the opening interview and the debrief interview afterwards. And quite quickly, I could see that there was a lady living with this. I didn't meet the lady that she was caring for, the participant was caring for, but this was a carer of someone living with dementia in her home. And her friend, a very good friend, and just calmly reading through this and reading through the diary towards the end, the last paragraph, or the second to last, I should say, and this person who was living with her died. And she put that in the diary. She talked about her experience of using technology to look after her, to get in touch with her family and friends, to even to some extent, like, to understand what to do next after this event had occurred at such a time in the morning. So when we talk about skeuomorphism, when we talk about over 65s, I think we need to talk about the conduits, the carers, the other people involved in that situation as well, and testing for them and exploring with that population also. Bit of a sad one, but it's deeply insightful, and I'm obviously very grateful to my participants for being so honest. So yeah, just to talk a little bit about kind of like our next steps. So I very much believe in developing appropriate research methods for over 65. So we need to go a little bit beyond experience recall, because it doesn't capture the things that are most meaningful, I guess. There's definitely a role, I would say, in skeuomorphism and in boarding people, and we've kind of taken that away. But we can't just put it back, because we wouldn't know what type of icons, what interface we would need to replicate. We need to understand that, and we need to get a better idea of that. Moreover, and this is something that the paper addresses with quite explicitly, that as an industry, certainly in my limited career so far, there's almost certainly an attitude that once everyone at the moment who's over the age of 65 just sort of drops off the internet, we'll all be fine and we'll all know how to use computers. And we won't need to worry about this pesky sort of like inclusion for older users. But the one thing that the diaries taught me, and through speaking to people, is that they were the most clued up, knowledgeable, fluent typists, health workers, receptionists, air pilots, rocket scientists, and they struggle to use computers now. And so we need to think really about what we're doing as an industry and as an area, really, because if we don't, it will be us. If we don't start including people into the design research stage, in 20, 30, 40 years' time from now, someone will come into Google, decide that we'll use our phones by blinking, and the technology will almost become removed from us. It will evolve onto the next step, and we won't be consulted because we haven't consulted those before us either. And it will be much, much harder for us because I've got quite attached to Facebook and my phone and things alike, so I think we'll actually suffer more as a result. So if not from any other reason but a very selfish perspective, we should be more engaged with this population, and we should look at appropriate research methods for them. However, I know that's tricky. You know, quite often people are very grateful to be, you know, user testing at all, and it's very tricky to say, now can we now turn this project to like looking at over 65s, and like companies go, well, that's not our audience, like, and we kind of have to go backward and say, like, well, we live in an aging population, and chances are someone over the age of 65 is using your website, and they are, you know, important. They are an important user. And not only that, there's very much the idea of kind of like a progressive service that you provide to users where the expression of an escalator, even broken or tricky, still works. It still serves its primary function as a staircase. And websites should be the same. So by providing and appropriating users who would have difficulty using the app or the website into your website service, you will in essence make it usable for everyone. Everyone will have the ability to use it by default. And so it's tricky, but if we continue to work in this area and write about it and kind of encourage others of like the financial benefit, at the very least, of being more inclusive in our designs. And I guess like we need to recognize like the needs of that user population. We need to spend more time speaking to people and getting involved in that. I think I've certainly been guilty of just assuming and just also assuming that even like over 65s as a whole group can just be like, oh, I've made this easy for over 65. You know, it's such a huge demographic to just casually say that I've thought about. So research will come through this, and one of the best ways we can do this is considering the needs and sharing those needs once we've found it, so that other people can benefit and other people can start including in the design, and we as an industry can become more inclusive as a whole. And the only way to do that is really through collaborative design. So thank you very much for that. Any questions? I can say this, but I think the best people to refer to are my co-authors. Is that okay? Is it okay to tap out to them because they're the good ones of this? Sorry. Yeah.
The philosophy of personhood, something that particularly fascinates me. I found the whole the subject, identity, and okay. Yeah. The subject, identity, the notion of personhood, and there's a certain amount of assumption that dementia in particular is something that destroys personhood. But in fact, of course, the reality is that those engaged in care are finding that personhood is not really that much defined in isolation, but much more in relation. And people, certainly in the early stages of dementia, but even right through to the later stages, maintain those relationships if the right people are around them, and their personhood continues, even if they've forgotten their own name. There are ways in which they relate to the people around them that are just like they always did. That element of who they are is still there. So amongst those who are working with people who are experiencing this debilitation of mental faculties, there's an understanding that in fact if you can maintain those relationships, dementia is not so much destroying as occluding, covering over a certain amount of personhood, and that the person is still there underneath.
I think part of the question was, how does technology help with that?
Absolutely. So, information communication technologies, obviously, are the means by which we have revolutionized the way in which we relate to one another. And it makes absolute sense for us to be able to extend that, those new possibilities, particularly to those with, who are experiencing the onset of dementia. The example of the old lady playing Call of Duty with her grandson, I think is a classic.
Thanks, Jesse. That was great. You touched upon innovative interaction design possibilities. And it was one thing you didn't touch upon, apart from kind of blinking to change whatever it was. It's sort of like a very futuristic idea, but probably not that so much, because investigation into other modalities for people, especially older people, to interact with technology is sort of a big field of design research. But I'm just wondering if any of your research came up with a kind of concepts of new interaction designs, either through a new icon to replace that floppy disk, or a way of interacting via other modalities like gesture or voice or anything like that. Have you got? Is that part of your research plan to get to that point?
It is, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
But I'm very happy to talk about kind of like three approaches that I feel quite have come out of the research. I've also feel like quite a lot of what it's saying. The biggest one actually at the moment is voice and voice control, and the effect of that, because that's very like sort of hidden away, I guess, on phones' features. It's not obvious that you can just push a button and speak into a phone, or speak to your website. The software Dragon dictation software. A lot of people use that just to conform to like the practices of how to use a computer, because they can kind of like new tab. They don't have to know what a tab is. It will know for them. And so there is a role, I think, in speaking things. And the Amazon, I always forget the box that's going to go into the home and this Internet of Home thing. Is it Cirrus or how? Yeah. But you can be like play soft jazz in this box. Yeah. The idea of like a connected home operated by voice will be a very powerful thing, I believe. In terms of gesture, yes, but the problem is gesture is so particular and so close to you. Like I'll wave my hands as I'm speaking in a very different way from someone else. And when we talk about like turning a light off, what would that be? We could use sign language, but that's not like a common language. So it definitely has application, but it would have to learn. And the final one is obviously virtual reality. Like the best one is one that adheres to the physical movements that you're already making, because they're going to be the last thing that you forget, in essence, in decline. Those very physiological bodily movements of something that responds to that environment. So yeah, you can change things or swipe and move, and it would be about you, in short.
Rick. Jessica, thank you very much indeed. Certainly always a challenge to put together a six hands piece. So I think the three-part chapter that you see in the book fits together very well, and fascinating today to find out much more about the empirical research taking place on with you and with Sigma. As a kind of follow-on from my colleague's question there, skeuomorphism, there's a certain amount of research that says that people stick with the technologies or the interface to the technologies that they learnt in their formative periods, whether that's teenage years or 20s, 30s. It seems to me that you're always going to have to be redesigning interfaces to technologies. So how will you've talked about skeuomorphism dying and coming back and being resurrected. How do you see this notion of designing to something that you're familiar with, serving us in a period in which there are many different age groups along the life cycle?
Right, yes, there are a few facets to that question which I'll try and answer. I'm a little bit like waffly on this topic, so I'll try and be dead concise. The first thing when we talk about like the skeuomorphism is the idea of like this interface, and I think we have an idea that that's fixed, and we should, in order to keep that fluent and congruent, we should have regular testing. It's all down to testing. Companies should be involved in that, and we should share that information and develop new practices constantly. We should never, every, say, like 10 years, decide, right, for the next 20, this is it. And I think there is a tendency to do that and then get angry when we find that restrictive. Testing needs to be the lifeblood of this process, because, yes, it's all very well to try and make something skeuomorphic, but I personally don't have the understanding, the frame of reference for that. I mean, I can understand now so much from speaking to people, the success of the mouse and the keyboard, but that's changing now with iPads. What will the future hold for us? What will be our lifeblood? And it's kind of up for the next generation to kind of get that to us. Yeah, testing, in essence, test and test again and share the results of the testing once you get it, so everyone can kind of keep evolving with it. There should never be a case where a huge company like Google or Facebook just decide that this is how we're going to do things now, because that won't relate to the rest of the population.
And do you see difficulties in creating standards, therefore? Do you see difficulties in creating standards if there's constant change and modification?
Absolutely. That's the sort of that'd be my future research really about what is really the standard. Certainly like WCAG and various accessibility companies have taken like an approach of developing rules, and there's something called a digital inclusion charter which the government has set up to make things usable. And what tends to happen with these things is that they become more of like a stick to beat people over the head with, rather than like a natural kind of like you should do this and you should feel happy doing it, and it should be easier for you to do. And so I don't have the answer yet, but it's definitely an area that I want to look into.
Thank you very much.
I'll ask the last one. You were saying about Google and Facebook and big companies like that shouldn't be able to take over. And the question that came to me during your presentation was, what kind of industries do you see directly benefiting from this research that you're doing? Is it Google and Apple, or is it like small and medium-sized companies? Is it the county, the state? Is it individual web design companies?
Yeah,
specifically?
I guess the main one, just I guess to interrupt you before I forget it, because I'm terrible at that, is the NHS and public bodies, which are at the moment under like such a huge amount of pressure. And what tends to happen, I went to a fantastic talk around Cheshire, organised by a housing association, Peaks and Plains, where a gentleman said, like, if you can build an iPhone, please don't build an iPhone. Please build something affordable and scalable for the NHS to use. If you, rather than going up, go sideways. And so the real benefits will be with public services, and really specifically around dementia, carers and the conduits of people who have been training people. So the children, relatives, family, partners. I mean, one of the most fantastic things that technology can do through various different like sights and sounds and uses is bring that person back to the person who is losing them, if only for brief periods of time, and that has an untold value, I would say.